Today I prepared a couple of things just for the club here, a few introductory items I thought would be of interest, and then I'm going to run you through a few of the type of things that I cover in my workshops. I'm just going to show a few sample portraits of my commissioned work that I've done over the years. These are primarily, at this point, are oil portraits. That's the most of my commissioned work is oil portraiture. That's what people generally want when they are paying for a portrait. I do family and individual and corporate type portraits. And these are, in all these cases, they're basically for, commission. I particularly enjoy commission to work where they give me a special situation like this one. They had an old black and white photo of this man who was the father of the person that commissioned it, who was raised in Italy, was from Italy, and the old black and white photo was him standing on a dock somewhere, and they wanted an Italian scene in the background, a vineyard. So those kinds of portraits are the most fun. This was also similar to that, where I get to put people in circumstances, show more than just their, what they look like, but how they're kind of their lifestyle. Now this, I'm going to show you a quick pastel demo. I do a lot of pastel, portrait demos, usually pastel. This was for an organization near Fort Worth. I was artist in residence this spring, and I did this demo for a meeting they had, and it was about an hour and a half demo of an interesting guy who was a roofer. He had really a rough-looking character, but he's also a Methodist minister, so I guess that kind of evens out. But anyway, this is just a sample of one of the demos I'll do, and edit it down to just 3 minutes, so you don't have to hopefully get too impatient. I'm going to use this particular picture to show a few things about portraits that I look for. And by the way, this is what I consider character study as opposed to a full portrait, which of course a full portrait is someone who's paying me to do it. Character study, I'm doing it for my own pleasure or for free in either case. And but I actually enjoy these far more than my commissioned works. They're more impressionistic and more expressionistic, and I really enjoy doing them, particularly when in a demonstration short time span, it loosens you up. It's a really good thing to do short portraits or any kind of painting where you have a limited time span. It forces you to fall back kind of to your instinct. This particular picture, I wanted to show you some lighting effects, the way I typically or like to light a portrait. This lighting setup on this person was I had a warm main light on his right that highlighted the warmth of his cheek. He was very ruddy complected, and even in the shadow areas it was very red and warm, partly because it was reflecting light from that red kerchief he was wearing. But generally speaking, I like to have a nice warm main light coming in from one side, and then on the other side a cool light lighting him either from the back or the side. And this would be lighting the shadowed portion of his face. And one thing I want to point out here is that on the shadowed portion of the face, it's dominantly cool as opposed to warm reds and yellows on the other side. On the cool side, even the bright light is a cooler temperature than the color or temperature on the other side. And for example, if you look at that ear over there, it was about the right value, but it's a lot cooler than the actual image I was painting. But what was important was that it was the right value and it was cool, and so it works. And if you'll notice here, even in the shadowed portion there, it runs more or less through the middle of his face there, the shadowed area, which is what I call the core shadow. It is also cool. It's a cool umber brown instead of a burnt sienna brown on the shadowed side. So those are kind of things that I always keep in mind, because in portraiture there's three major things. There's the pose, there's the lighting, and then there's the actual painting. And without the right lighting and pose, it's very difficult to have a really powerful painting. So posing and lighting are extremely important. That's why I emphasize that in my workshops, is to pose and light properly. And then if you do a halfway good painting, it'll come off. But if you're having to fix a poorly lit and posed image, it's very difficult to be successful. Now, I just now want to show a few just pastel character studies, some of my favorite kind of stuff. That basically these were all either hour and a half to 3 hour poses. Some were done in a group that we used to meet, and some were done as part of demonstrations for art organizations or whatever. This one is was interesting. I want to draw one little bit of information here that I thought would be helpful. If you look at her close up, you'll notice that in this area right in here, next to her right eye, it was a shadow in there, which I put in there about the right value, but it was just flat and dead. It was a kind of an umber, but it's kind of flat and dead, and it's often happens in portraiture or landscape. You put it in a large area, and it may be right in every way, except it just looks kind of, deadened. And so what I typically do will take a complementary color. In this case, it was a blue, and just scumble it through the section of the kind of flat, dead color, and it enlivens it. Now, it also emphasizes the fact that when I'm painting portraits, and I'll speak more about this later, but when I'm painting portraits, I don't think of the fact that this is skin or not skin. It's just a color, and it's a value, it's a hue, and whatever works for the image in terms of that more objective viewpoint is what's important. It's very intimidating sometimes to do things like that, because you think, well, there's no blue like that in a person's face or skin. Well, you won't see it if you think about skin, but if you just think about hue and color and value, you'll get away from being messed up by your preconceptions of what skin should look like. What's important is whether it's a good piece of art. So I'm going to talk a little bit about posing and lighting, and feel free to ask questions, by the way. I'm more than happy to answer any I can. We're going to look at a pose here where there's a single light, a spiral pose was the main part of it. Here's the subject posing, where whether I'm doing just their head or their whole body, I usually pose the whole body because the head and the tilt of the head and the shoulders are affected by the whole body pose. This one is a typical pose that's spiral in that the hips are facing one way, the upper body's facing a little bit another way, the head is facing then even more another way, and the eyes are turned either to another angle. So it kind of creates a spiral, which makes a little more dramatic look. In this case, I was interested in the pose, not making any real attempt to paint a portrait of the person, but mainly interested in the pose. This was the pastel done from that. Then another posing situation in lighting, two lights, forward-leaning pose with a shoulder tilt. This is also a very typical pose, a very good pose. It's dramatic. The character's leaning into you, he's moving towards you, his shoulders are at a different angle, they're not squared at you like a mugshot. He's got a strong warm light on one side and a cool light on the other. And this is typical, you'll see this a lot in interviews when they're interviewing people on TV and so forth. This is the kind of lighting that you'll tend to see. And it makes for a little bit more dramatic contrast, and the general pose just looks more dynamic. It creates somewhat of a diagonal with the shoulder. This particular one, this was about a 45-minute work. It was doing it for a demo, and it was cut short because of some problem. I forget what. I think the model passed out or something. I forgot to give him a break. But let's see, some more posing and lighting. This is two lights with a warm main light and a hot backlight. The subject is above eye level, which I typically do them above eye level. People are have a little bit more flattering. It's more flattering to the model or to the subject if they're a little above eye level as opposed to below eye level. And it involves also a spiral and strong diagonals. And I analyze all of this when I'm setting up a demo. I used to be a portrait photographer in my earlier life, and so a lot of this it comes from that. That's the reason I emphasize portrait posing and lighting. This was the subject. She was an authentic biker, and Jennifer, a great gal, but very imposing, as you can tell. But you see the twist of the head's twisted, turned, her eyes then are turned another little bit more. She's got the diagonals with the way her arms are positioned. It creates a kind of a dramatic look, and then a warm light on her left with a even warmer backlight to really accentuate that shadowed part of the face. And one thing I want to mention at this point, backlights of some kind are very helpful, either back or side lights that add a little light to the side of the shadow side of the face. It also can be just simple bounce light, but it helps define the shape of the face on that shadowed portion of the face, which can be just kind of very dead and not show much, and that backlight really helps. I will also mention on a portrait, we typically in portraiture would when I was in photography, we would you would always, when you did a 3/4 view of a person, you would light the small area, the quarter that's distant, and have the side that dominates the face would be in shadow. And the reason for this is that it slims you down. It makes you look slimmer. It takes off about 10 pounds. So whenever you can, make the model look as good as possible, it's not always necessary, but it does help. Here is, by the way, through here, by putting in that backlight, hitting their back cheek, it creates what's called a core shadow. Now that whole side of her face is in shadow, but when you have a bounce light or a backlight catching the back edge of that shadow, it creates a core shadow that runs through the center of that shadowed area, and it really defines that cheek. So you can really see a shape there that otherwise you would not be able to see. And it would be just a much less interesting.
Mike,
Yes.
Is that back light below or above the...
I usually have it below. I try to depict a naturalistic effect to some extent. The warm light, the main light from above, representing the sun, the bounce light or the backlight from below, representing as if it were bouncing off of the ground or a wall or something. It usually comes in at an angle. It's roughly the thinking there. Yes?
I was noticing that on the shadow side of her face, even though like the eye that's for us on the left-hand side, that eye had a lot of light on it, and the shadow kind of goes underneath and around.
You talking about here?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I was wondering because it seems like it might be in shadow because of her nose, but there's a light that's like right on. Typically,
I try to light when I'm lighting main light from one side. I want some of the light to bounce to go past her nose and and create a triangle of light on this cheek.
Yeah.
And in this case, it's also catching her eye.
Oh, okay.
And it actually probably looks a little brighter than it is because of the nature of values. Is that when something a light value is surrounded by darks, it even appears lighter than it really is. So that might be, accentuating, even though that's not as light as it is over here. It is being hit by light, and I usually will have a little light crossing over and into that shadow area. And if you'll notice here, all the darks are pretty much cool darks, as opposed to the darker values on this side are warm. Now here's two lights leaning forward with a shoulder tilt. I always try to have a shoulder tilt.
Got a question over here.
Yes, I'm sorry. Paul.
Could you talk about whether the main light is a soft light or a hard light, or somewhere in between?
I generally like it to be a soft light, somewhat diffused and from a distance. And the other light will vary just depending on the nature of the subject matter. But usually I try to soften it, even though I have an example here of kind of a hard light. Up to now it's been more or less soft main lights. Okay, and then there's the subject from that. This guy from Pecos. Let's see, single light. Then this is the one I was referring to. Basically a chiaroscuro. It's more than just a single light. It's a very chiaroscuro with a head tilt and strong diagonals. And this is obviously this is the kind of thing you'd see in a medieval or something like Caravaggio or someone with one main strong light creating this chiaroscuro effect. Now you can't see it here, and this is the nature of photography. Photos, the darks and shadows tend to go much darker than they really are, and the lights tend to go a little lighter. So you won't see it as much in this photo as I actually saw when I was doing the painting. But the painting, there was a lot more detail that you could see in the hands and in the fabric and so forth. And this created a very strong diagonal movement through the painting that followed her eye movement. that made for an interesting pose as well as lighting situation. In this last one, I'm just going to mention quickly the painting process I follow with every portrait, the certain steps I go through in the biggest and most simple explanation is first an overall drawing, and then I map the darks. I try to do a high contrast mapping of my darks, which are primarily the shadows, taking another step. But I want to match it so that I can look at the negative space shapes in here and compare them to my subject and see, are those negative and positive shapes, do they look the same? Analyze each one individually to try to make it as close as possible to my subject matter. This, by the way, is the only portrait, other than my commission portraits, this is the only portrait in here that was actually done from a photo instead of from life. And then here, the next step, after I map the darks and so forth, and put the darks and secondary darks in, then I go in and put in my lightest lights and darkest darks. And my darkest darks, and then my lightest lights, and then my secondary lights. And then the toned surface with the paper, which is a 50% value, serves as a placeholder for all my middle tones. And that's going to be all where I start putting in all the hues and so forth. But I have the lightest light and the darkest darks, and so I can work towards the middle tone from this point. And there's the finish on that. I'll point out a couple of things on here. The cast shadows you really want to be careful of on a portrait. It's more important than many other places. Is wherever there's a cast shadow where something is actually blocking the light, it causes a cast shadow, which is usually darker than your form shadows. It's got a harder edge. So you got that one. You got the cast from the nose there, and from this, in this case, cast shadow from the backlight coming in here low and being blocked by the kerchief. And then your form shadows, which are basically the shadows that are created when the form turns from the light. It turns from the light and it gradually changes from light to shadow. And those all need to be relatively soft. So, for example, on this cheek, the nose where the light is slowly transitioning in here on the chin, and several other places you can find these, but it's very important to know the difference, because you'll end up making the person look like they're cut out of a rock if you confuse the soft and the cast shadows and the form shadows. So here is some of the material I go through when I'm doing a portrait workshop. I start out with a definition of portraiture, which is pretty obvious. It's basically the likeness of a person, so on and so forth. But then there's an artistic definition, which is one by Pablo Picasso. I found it interesting. When you start with a portrait and search for a pure form, a clear volume, through successive eliminations you arrive inevitably at the egg. Likewise, starting with the egg and following the same process in reverse, one finishes with the portrait. I thought that was an interesting thought process I went through there. But that's an artist's definition. In reality, this is John Singer Sargent's definition. A portrait is a painting with something wrong with the mouth. And if you've done many portraits, you know that that's true. The problem being is all the other features in the face are held firm by muscle and cartilage. The mouth is totally flesh. And even the slightest little twinge of the corner of the mouth, it can go from a smile to a sneer. And so it's very difficult to catch the expression with something like that, with the lips. And it's also hard to make them look like flesh rather than like they're got a bone or a cartilage in them. There's a certain trick to that. Another one by him, every time I do a portrait, I lose a friend. This is also very, very true. If you get into doing many portraits, don't bother asking the subject if they like it. Have you ever listened to yourself on a tape recorder?
Oh, God.
Did you like it? Well, it's the same thing with a portrait. You don't like what you look like in a portrait, no matter how good it is. Ask the wife or the husband or friends. Then you'll get some feedback that's meaningful, but don't ask the sitter.
And you also don't know what you look like because you see yourself in the mirror.
Right, exactly. Unless you're, an actor that's constantly seeing themselves, you really don't know what you look like. Edward Munch, I'm sure you know who he is. When I paint a person, his enemies always find his portrait a good likeness. If you don't know, the scream is his face.
Yeah, right.
Okay. Now, in my workshops, I've stressed studying lines, proportions, values, shapes, edges, temperature, unity, perspective, and the human face. That's the last thing I'm concerned about in many ways, is because if you concentrate on the face itself, you tend to try to paint your preconceptions. But if you think in terms of the aesthetic categories of color, hue, value, shapes, edges, think of those more objective categories, which I call aesthetic categories, and not literal categories. You'll really be more effective, and you'll be able to produce more accurate, actually, and expressive portraits. Now, one of the interesting things about portraiture is that it's such a natural instinct to want to do portraits, and artists, unfortunately, sometimes are intimidated by it. But I want to encourage you, if you haven't done any portrait work, to really consider it. It's the most fascinating subject in the world. We know this from several sources. Advertising, they've known it for years, that portraiture are pictures with people in them, ads with people in them, are going to get the most attention. We want to see ourselves, the human face and form. This is a great quote from a museum director. Every great art museum is in effect a museum of the art of portraiture. If you think about the museums you've been in, that's really what we want to see through the ages. George Bernard Shaw had a great quote. He said, you look into a mirror to see your face. You look at art to see your soul. And I think that's even more true in terms of studying portraits. We really want to see the soul of that person. So why is portraiture such a natural pursuit, which I propose? First of all, we're born instinctively knowing how to identify the human face. Infants know the human face. They can identify their mother from a nurse or from the father within hours after birth. And adults are tremendously, in most cases, some of us are losing that, but in most cases have a great memory for faces. And you can know and identify distinctly thousands of faces and pick them out of a crowd. That's an incredible ability when you think about it. That's basically because we're masters of facial recognition, because we are pattern factories. We look for patterns everywhere. I'm sure you've known yourself. You look at, tile on the floor or stains on the ceiling. Before long, you'll see a face, and because we're made to look for those patterns, the human face pattern. So it's very natural that we would have innate skills in order to paint or draw that human face, just with a little help. I think it's easier than landscapes, because every face is within a 4 or 5% tolerance, looks like every other face. The proportions of the human face are extremely consistent, even from race, ethnic race to another ethnic race. It's very similar. It's only because we're so good at seeing those patterns that we can tell the difference. But you've seen it before. You go to a country you've never been to, a different ethnic group, and everybody looks the same, but before long you can identify them easily. Or you see a pair of twins, you can't tell the difference between them. Once you get to know them, you have no problem. So we do have a very strong sense of pattern recognition in terms of faces. In landscapes, there's not any one singular attribute of landscapes that you can consistently promise will be in a portrait, in a painting. But in a portrait, if it's of a person, there's going to be those features, and they're going to be in a certain proportional relationship with slight variations from individual to individual. So, what we have in portraiture is actually the study of proportions. And this is a drawing from a demonstration I did. And in essence, any portrait is determined by how well you place the proportions. And that's what gives you the real image of the person. But it's getting the proportions right that's the main thing. And particularly looking at the face here that's important. That triangular shape of the eyebrows down to the mouth, that's where the likeness is. That's what you focus on, that's what you spend your time on. If you get that right, the rest of it just needs to be reasonably close. If you want the likeness though, that's where it is in that triangle. That's why I will spend most of my time working that area and then the rest as best I can. Now, since we are studying proportions here, the nice thing about proportions is that they are in essence ratios, aren't they? And what are ratios? It's math. Now, a lot of people really hate the idea of math. They got into art just so they could avoid ever having to learn any math. But ratios are math, and so drawing and painting is really intuitive math. It's exercising a control over proportions, no less than a mathematician, but you're doing it intuitively, and it makes it a little bit more fun. And this is probably the one single thing that I think would be the most important message to take away from today on portraiture. It's by Daniel Green. I was at a portrait convention that he spoke at, and this was the one single thing that I took away that was the most important. The likeness has a great deal more to do with proportions of length than it does with drawing a perfect nose, a perfect eye, or a perfect mouth. It's the proportional relationship of the features, not whether you've drawn the eye perfectly or the nose. Now, it's important to learn how to do those, but it's where you place them that's really important in terms of getting a likeness. I spoke about facial recognition, and of course we're all kind of familiar, I think, probably with nowadays with the digitized ability to identify faces with computer software and digital cameras. It's really amazing. These are a few samples of the kind of patterns that these digital cameras, what they're reading on your face. These patterns. This is an actual formula for a face. Your face is a mathematical formula. It can be broken down to a mathematical formula because that's all computers read, right? So it creates a mathematical formula out of your face. So again, artists, you can't get away from math, but fortunately, you can do it intuitively. I think humans are far better at pattern recognition than a computer is. There may be some things that you can do faster, but the ability of the human to recognize patterns and reproduce them is really astounding. Look at who is this? Who is it?
It's you.
Who is it? Squint.
Still don't know.
Squint a little.
Mona Lisa.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
The Mona Lisa. Now look how little information you needed to recognize that likeness. You don't see any details, but you see the likeness because first of all, you know the person, the image, and secondly, it's the placement of the major features in that triangle that tells you who it is without any detail. And of course, we can take a step more, and there she is. Who's this? I'm sorry, what?
When you start a portrait, do you start from the inside out or from the outside in?
That's a very perceptive question. You can do it different ways. Over the years, I used to do it working kind of from the outside in, The problem being if you're a little bit off, your face will get kind of scrunched up, you know. So I generally teach starting from the inside, working out, with a lot of careful measurements we'll talk about. Who is this? George Washington. Isn't that amazing? It's really amazing their ability to recognize a face with so little information. That's why it's important when you start a painting, you're not to focus on the details. Focus on the structure. Squint. Paint only what you can see when you're squinting when you start the painting. Not start painting and then you put I got a perfect eye here and then I'm going to go on and do a perfect nose. Well, if you didn't get those two in the right relationship, it doesn't make any difference how good you did them. It's getting them together and that's why you start out with big, simple strokes and break them down in detail until you have the image.
You wait.
Was there a question? I'm sorry. Okay. Rules are the building blocks of creativity, not the stumbling blocks. This was a great poet, Cynthia Mahon, my wife, by the way. But this is so true. When I was going through art school, it was kind of the opposite of this. Oh, no rules. Don't learn rules. Just do what feels right. And that works to some extent. If you're a 2-year-old on a piano, great. You know, no rules, just be creative. Well, you know how long you want to listen to that, unless it's your own grandchild, maybe. But it takes rules. It takes learning the rules so that you can master them and then really be expressive. And we're going to be talking about a few rules here. And I'm going to introduce some head schematics, the way the head is constructed. Again, we're going to be kind of going into the math world. He's starting out with a circle, and by the way, this is presented by Andrew Loomis. I've taken this from his books. That's where I learned most everything I know is from Andrew Loomis. And of course, as an artist, he's Andre, but to his close personal friends, he's Andrew. Even though he died before I was born, but I consider him a good friend. Okay, you start out with a circle. You divide that in half. I'm going to go through this quickly. Don't try to remember it. And then you divide it in half and you box it off on 3 sides. You divide that into 6, those horizontal measurements, and in the thirds. And you take one of those 6 there, the width of one of those 6, and you add it to the bottom beneath that circle to complete the box. And this is the structure basically of the head. You take the distance from the center line to the bottom of the box, you divide it in half and you put in a line that's halfway. Then you take this distance here and you add it to the top above the center line so that you have these 3 segments. And then you divide the 16ths into 12ths, as you can see there. And then you take the overall box and you divide it in half. And this is a little bit more detailed on the human head. And then you can see this is a third measurement and a third measurement and a third measurement of the face. That's basically the face portion of the head. And this is taking away some of the details so that we can look at the features. The first line up here represents the hairline. This line that was the center of the circle represents the brow. This line that's the center of the box represents the eye. And then this line that's halfway from the eye, from the brow to the nose, that's the nose. And then from there up down is the chin. Who's this? Everybody gets that. I have never shown this. Everybody didn't get it. Incredible. Talk about an iconic image and how little detail it takes to recognize it. Okay, now I'm getting back to work. That's just to wake people up. Okay. This is the eyes on that eye level. They're put in there. They're exactly 1/6 across. The distance between the eyes is 1/6. And of course each eye ideally should be the same size. The eyebrows go across the brow here a little bit below on the inside, a little bit above on the outside, and then down at a 45-degree angle. Then the nose, the base of the nose where it touches the upper lip is right here. And the mouth is about a third of the way down to the chin. And then you can start filling in where all the other features fall. When I teach a workshop, my expectation is that they won't be able to remember all this at the workshop, but they take home the literature, and if you're interested in portraiture, you want to be able to draw this starting with the circle without any aid and go through the entire process so that you know and you've created a grid in your mind of the proportions of the human face. Once you have that grid, this is the ideal human face, by the way. This is what you see in comic books, or if you're George Clooney. So, perfect proportions. Now, everybody varies a little bit from the perfect proportions, by and large, but cover models and others, one reason they're beautiful is because they have those proportions. But once you have that proportional grid implanted and impressed on your brain, then it will be a grid to work on for your own drawing and painting, and you'll be light years ahead because you'll be starting out already knowing 80 to 90% of what a person looks like. If you told me, okay, you're going to do a portrait of a person, the guy's 40, he's got a full head of hair, normal weight, Caucasian, I could, 3/4 view, I could put that down, and then when he shows up, just finish off the variations based upon his particular measurements. So that's why I say portraiture can be easier than landscapes if you learn this grid. Now, the first question I always have, so I'll bring it up, well, what if they're not looking right at you? Well, that's the beauty of your mind. It can interpolate in 3 dimensions. So that if you know this proportional relationship, you can interpolate it from different angles, and you'll basically know because it feels right when you draw it. Because you know this grid so well, this scheme. Anyway, that's my sermon on the proportions. Now, I'll mention that these measurements from the chin to the nose, from the nose to the eyebrow, and from the brow to the hairline are the most important proportions on any likeness. You must get those right to get a good likeness. And if you think about it, that's pretty simple. That's just 3 simple basic proportions. But if you don't get them, no matter how well you do everything else, you will have difficulty getting a likeness. Because those 3 big, gross proportions very much define the likeness of a person. And usually you can tell if the likeness is in a portrait in the first 10 or 15 minutes if you get those 3 proportions correct. Now, for women, it's the same proportions with slight variations, feminine features. The eyebrows are usually a little higher above the eye. All the features are softer and sometimes a little bit less chin dominance, but by and large the same basic proportions. Children and infants are they have the same basic structure, but their own unique proportions that makes them look like babies and children and adolescents. We won't get into that. The head here, basically, if you take an eye unit, the width of an eye, and you square it, like here's an eye unit, is the squared width of an eye. The head from cheek to cheek is 5 eye units, and is 7 units in height. So that's just a rough, quick way to get a basic proportion of a face. Who's this? A little bit harder.
It's
John Wayne, very good. Very good.
Oh, yeah.
It's amazing. Okay. So I'm going to show you the secret of drawing and show you some how you apply that secret to doing portraits, and we'll be finished. The secret is measurement. We're all subject to distortions and optical illusions. So when you're painting, no matter how experienced you are as an artist, you need to use some measuring in the process. The more experienced you are, the less the measuring needs to be explicit. It can be more instinctive, where you can just kind of you can judge it just by the way, just by looking at it. But as you're learning particularly, you need to learn very careful measurement. That's the way you get accuracy in drawing, whether it's a landscape or a portrait. And I will say for you landscape artists, in which I hope I am as well, as you study portraiture, your landscape work will improve because your drawing abilities will drastically improve from working in portraiture. So if you want to be a better landscape artist, study portraiture because you will learn measurement. And so we're going to look at a few measuring techniques that I teach in my workshop and that I personally use, even though I don't typically use them when I'm doing quick demos because they do slow down the process. Here is a model that I've used in the past. We're going to try to transfer her image to a canvas here. And the first thing we do is look at the tilt of her head. This is the first thing I always want to know, is the tilt of her head. And then I transfer that over to my drawing and place it someplace roughly on the sheet that I know it needs to go. You know, not right on the edge, but roughly where I need it needs to go. And then I look at her brow and get the angle there. And usually the subject I have is just like this. If I'm doing a portrait of a person, I have them off to the side of my canvas where I can see the canvas and the subject in one glance. And I will hold the pencil or whatever on her brow, for example, and then I'll just slide it over to my painting and match that angle. Okay? So that's the first step, relatively easy. The next thing is I place a mark someplace along this line, it can be anywhere, someplace along this line that indicates the base of her nose. Because you're going to do your measuring based upon a nose unit of measure. Not an inch or a millimeter, but a nose unit. And the placement of that base of the nose can be anywhere, but obviously the bigger you make it, the bigger the whole picture is going to be. So you have to take in consideration how big you want it to be. And, basically that's what I was saying there. Then I take a nose unit from the model and measure her nose from the base of her nose to the brow line. And then I compare it to the base of the chin to the base of the nose. And if you look here, there's a slight gap between her nose and this nose unit. So the distance from her nose to her brow is a little less than from her nose to the base of her chin, you know where the bone is here. That's important to note that, because then I'm going to take over here, I'm going to take the drawing nose unit, which can be any size, measure it, go down, leave a similar gap, and mark it, and that's the base of the chin. And then I do the same thing to find her hairline. Find it's a little shorter, which makes sense because she's leaning back a little bit. Her chin is closer to me, it's larger. The angle is foreshortening, so it's going to be larger and get smaller towards the top. So her forehead is a little bit smaller than the nose unit. And then you got these four basic things set up. Then I find her mouth just simply by taking and dividing the lower portion into thirds after I make sure that it is a third here. And we find that third and mark it. Do the same thing to find the eyes up here. I measure down, and sure enough, that eye line, which is the corner of that to the corner of the eye, is exactly a third between the brow and the nose. Okay, you mark it. And then you've got it's kind of like the framework for sculpting, where you put in the framework. Everything is in the right proportions. You just finish it off from here. This is the most important thing you do for the entire portrait. It's like building a house. What's the most important thing? The foundation. This is the foundation. If you don't get it right, you're going to be in trouble. Because you're not going to be able to fix it very well, you know, when you've got the walls up and you've got the windows set in, and all of a sudden you realize, you know what, this was a 2-story building. And I did a foundation for a 1-story. So you've got to really spend your time getting these measurements, double checking, triple checking them, okay? So why is it important to spend so much effort to get these large measurements correct? And I've kind of answered that. If the big proportions are not correct, small proportions and features will not fix the drawing. So that's why the big ones are so important to get right. And they're the easiest, really. Another reason is you will not have dependable reference points from which to make your additional measurements if the first big ones aren't right. And then when drawing is not correct, and this is probably the most critical part for your painting, if the drawing isn't correct, you'll start trying to fix the drawing in the painting process, and you will tighten up. And you won't be fluid, you won't be spontaneous, you'll be trying to fix errors in the painting process. The painting process should be spontaneous and built on a dependable framework to get the kind of impressionistic, expressionistic painting I like anyway. Okay, and then you take that eye unit and you consistently use it to start measuring all the other aspects of the face. From parts of the face that you've already established as dependable. So you take that eye unit, you check and see where it is, find the corner of the eye, for example, on each side. You can start measuring anything you want. These are the little smaller fine references, and you find where those corners are, and then you go into triangulation to really strengthen what you're doing. When you triangulate, and I'll show you what I mean by that, you confirm or correct your initial measurements. And this is a process of editing, correcting, doing something and correcting it. And here's the way you correct it. We found that eye earlier. Now we take a nose unit. We measure from the base of the nose to the corner of the eye at this angle, whatever the angle is. And then, in this case, you can see it's exactly a nose unit to the corner of her eye. And then I see, look at my drawing. Did my drawing match that? And if it didn't, I correct it. But that's triangulating, two ways to find the same point, and you want them both to end up in the same point. And then you know, I've got that eye. No matter what happens, I know that's the corner of the eye. If it doesn't look right, it's because something else is wrong, because I've triangulated. Same thing on this eye. And it's a little less than a full nose unit. Anyway, use that to start carefully correcting your drawing. Now we look at vertical and horizontal plumb lines to further detail this portrait. You locate the features, other features based upon the established reference points you've already confirmed, okay? Does this sound very scientific and detailed and accurate? Have you ever watched a gymnast perform or a jazz musician play the piano? It seems effortless and not even looking at the piano, it just seems like there's no effort at all. Do you know the work that went into looking effortless? Well, this is the work you go into to make a painting look effortless. Nikolai Fechin is probably one of the best known portrait artists that has this incredible, spontaneous, it looked like he threw paint at the canvas, but it just happened to turn out looking gorgeous. He was also known for his slow, tedious painting. It takes work to look easy. But as you learn this, it would become more and more instinctual, where you don't have to necessarily do it. But if you run into a problem, well, you do a little measurement. But you start out, you better learn all of this as carefully as you can. So plumb lines. Drop a plumb line from the eye. It happens to intersect the corner of that mouth. Drop a plumb line from that corner and locate the mouth. Drop a plumb line from the other side in the middle of the eye, find the other corner of that mouth. You start finding, you do a horizontal plumb line. It's just a little bit more than a nose unit from the center of that line. You mark that cheek. And so you just go around. you mark the perimeter of the face. And that is the kind of a detailed framework. You should be able to get this done in 15 to 20 minutes, once you're experienced at it. Then you find other details that you want. And using this same unit of measure, by the way, is very important. It doesn't have to be a nose unit. It could be, a chin to bottom of the nose unit, whatever is easy for you. But I have found that a nose unit is the most dependable because all the others can be covered by hair and by hats and by everything else. But usually you can see the base of the nose to the eyebrow. So it's just a good dependable measuring tool. And it makes it simpler, and it also constrains it so that everything is measured in terms of this one nose unit so that everything will stay in proportion. And then you basically fill out the drawing. And then you go into using angle lines in conjunction with the plumb lines to confirm it correct. You look at the angular lines here, and then you compare them to your drawing. Do they match? And you go through and you look at as many angles as you want to. For example, I do an angle here on this jaw. It goes right down to the point of where her sweater comes right there. Right there. See, I can say, okay, well that's correct because it's just inside that line and that line. And you do this just by holding your pencil up and using those angle lines. And you can confirm other locations on the subject that you got it right. Now, if that drawing, if this wasn't there, it's over here, then I've got to move it over. Unless you decide that, it looks better the other way. It's your option. Here you drop a plumb line through the center of the eye, it hits the corner of the mouth. It goes to this side of that thing. These are the things, by the way, when I'm doing a portrait, not just a quick demo, I'm doing every one of these things I'm showing you. I carefully measure and plot and see where things are intersecting. Are they intersecting like they're supposed to? If I run a line through that eye, does it really hit the corner of the eye on the model and hit the point of this? And if you run enough of these plumb lines, you will have a drawing that is accurate as a photograph. And I've actually done this and taken a picture, put it on my Photoshop, and compress it until it was the same size as the photo, and overlap them, and they'll be square on, maybe a few things here, there, a little bit off, and you can fix it. But it really does create accuracy. And accuracy is what it's all about when it comes to accurate portraits. So, in summary, right on time. First of all, you want to establish the head tilt, consistent unit of measure, preferably a nose unit as a rule. Use triangulation, plumb lines, and angle lines to confirm your measurements. And that is, in a nutshell, part of what we go through in my portrait workshops. And however, if you get one of Andrew Loomis's books, which he has several books out on portraits and figure and other things, he was a magazine illustrator back in the 30s and 40s. He was a master teacher, and he wrote these wonderful books, and nothing's been done as good as since he produced his. If you look at his books, fortunately, they used to be $300 to buy one online because they were out of print decades ago, but they're being reprinted, and they are available for like $25 or $30. It's the best investment you'll make if you're interested in portraits or figure drawing. So I'll leave you with that recommendation, and thank you very much.